delighted to have the Young Foundation here today, and we've got kind of a few people who will introduce themselves, who will support the presentation and facilitation of this session. And like peer research for me, and a kind of a part of my career has kind of been as a researcher. It's like, so important in how we can really amplify the voices of our communities. And of course, there are very different ways of doing that. But there's never been more important in terms of the changes that our communities have been through to really, support people to do that. So I'm really excited for this session. And Young Foundation have been doing some excellent work over the years in this space, and really looking forward to the subject and kind of like how we develop peer research as a capability. And before I hand over, as I said kind of a few minutes ago, if you're just joining, do introduce yourself in the chat, like where you're from and like what brings you here today. But I'm going to hand over, I believe, to Angela. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Noel. Thanks for that lovely introduction. I'm Ange Broadbridge. I am peer research lead at the Young Foundation. I'm going to start by saying, I think, a little bit about my background. So I've spent probably hundreds of hours now training community researchers and really building capacity for peer research, first for the Complex Needs programme in the Newcastle Gateshead area, and now at Young Foundation. And I've kind of worked at the softer end in terms of the more kind of storytelling peer research around advocacy particularly, and then moved into the harder end with peer research projects in Newcastle Gateshead around things like drug-related deaths, mental health and offending, and homelessness particularly. And I guess I've been brought on this peer research journey by a real kind of curiosity. Curiosity is one of my core values, and I got really interested in exploring what could be possible when exploring, how this model of peer research is embedded in communities, because I want to live in a world where this type of knowledge is really valued and gets the status that I think that it deserves. And for me, it's been hugely satisfying seeing people use their gifts, their really unique assets, to bring their and their peers' stories and experiences into the fore. So today we'll talk about some of the strengths and limitations of peer research approaches and look at some of the gaps in the approach as well. I'm just looking in the chat there, I can see we've got some peer researchers here. We've also got some people who have experienced using or commissioning peer research in the past. I think I just want to start with a bit of a call to action, really, to say that what we really want you to do is to get involved and come and work with us and come on a peer research journey, because we need more of us. I'm going to share some slides with you and walk you through a couple of reports that the Young Foundation have published in recent months around peer research in the UK particularly, and then focus a little bit more on peer research in the policy context. Let me have a look. I'm just going to ask if someone could give me a little nod to say that you can see my slides.
Yeah, I can see them.
Brilliant, thank you. There we go. So by way of a bit of an agenda for the session today, I'm going to be discussing with you findings from our recent reports. We're going to have a bit of a conversation about the Young Foundation's peer research network. I'm joined today by Nurjahan, one of our peer researchers, so I'm going to be discussing with her some of the real opportunities that we think peer research can bring. And then we're going to break out into some rooms and we'll have some really nice, a lengthy opportunity for some networking to explore what you might want from a peer research network and have a think about some of the opportunities that you might see for peer research shaping kind of policy and evidence base and recommendations. So I'm peer research lead at the Young Foundation. We're a charity based in London. We were set up by the social innovator Michael Young in the 50s, and we have a mission to develop better connected communities across the UK. One of the core ways that we do this is through research to understand community life across the 4 nations. So we have a particular strength and heritage really in ethnographic and participatory research particularly. And today I'm going to be talking about one strand of this, which is peer research. So what is peer research? Peer research is a participatory research method in which people with lived experience of the issues that are being studied are really taking part in directing and conducting research. And for me, this is really about moving away from the more kind of extractive model of social research and empowering people to affect positive change in their communities by participating in research on their own communities. So a peer researcher might be someone say in a rural kind of Scottish village talking to other residents about living in rural Scotland, or it might be someone who's experienced domestic abuse talking to others who've experienced domestic abuse. At the Young Foundation, we're particularly focused on strengthening communities across the UK. So our peer researchers are usually recruited to speak to others in their own communities. And therefore, we're kind of focusing on that real sort of place-based peer relationship. Can I just check on my slides moving along? Yes.
Yeah, they seem to be, yeah.
Thank you. So last year, the Young Foundation launched a national peer research network, and our vision for this network is to be built on high quality research standards.
I think we might have lost Angela.
I think we might have lost Ange. Let me just see if we can find her.
Might be an internet connection issue. If you haven't already, do continue to introduce yourselves in the chat while we try and retrieve Angela.
She's back.
I'm so sorry, that's my Wi-Fi.
No worries, Angela.
It wouldn't be a Teams event in a pandemic if we didn't have an IT crisis. Let me share my slides with you again. Thanks so much for your patience. Hopefully I'm just starting where I left off.
Yeah, no, we can
There
see.
we go. Yeah, so we really want to improve the way that peer researchers are recruited and trained, as well as compensated for their time. And I think that's really important too, and accredited for their skills. And I think by legitimising that peer research approach, it's really a way of kind of bringing about new insights and voices and evidence that would perhaps otherwise be ignored. And just thinking then a little bit too about why Young Foundation are doing this. We're doing this because we really believe that collecting that better quality data about people's lives and experiences leads to better and more inclusive policy and decision making. And for me, that's the case from the very hyper-local, but also to the national level, that when decision makers really understand people's experiences better, they're much more likely to be responsive to people's needs. So just to put this in context with a bit of a case study, I'm going to talk a bit about our Amplify Barking and Dagenham project. In 2016, just 72% of Barking and Dagenham residents said that they were satisfied with social cohesion in their area. And this was a peer research project that really aimed to get beyond those statistics. So hearing directly from residents about their experiences of social cohesion particularly. And the insights that were generated were used to promote community-led action on the issues that really mattered most to people locally. We worked with 7 peer researchers who were trained and employed over 17 months, and we spoke with over 600 local people about their views and experiences. And this project used something that we now call our Amplify model. So really combining a research and a storytelling and an action base to build a movement of people who were really committed to tackling some of the issues that came out of the research findings. And the data that was gathered was really rich, both in insight and nuance. So it covered a range of different perspectives that were held by local people. So, for example, when discussing some of the reasons why people of different ethnicities, for example, didn't mix as much as people of the same ethnicity, some of the respondents really shared a belief that people in the community maybe chose to speak in a non-English language to exclude other residents. And then the corollary of that is that other people really reported personal and quite traumatic experiences of racist abuse that was received in the community. And I think that this diversity of belief and experience over something that was a deeply sensitive issue was able to be articulated so very openly by residents is a real testament for me to that peer research approach, and very much about engendering trust between the respondent and the researcher. Some of the actions that came out of that work, very, very practical actions, involved organising community litter picks for neighbours to bond over a shared activity, the creation of a local parents support group, for example. And I think ultimately the project was successful really in forging a pathway for residents to move from just talking about the issues to really doing something to address them. So I think that real link between kind of peer research findings linking into social action starts to then feel like a bit of a theory of change. The use of peer research was really central to the success of this example, and I think there were some key reasons why. So peer researchers were very much able to help to validate the voice of local people, empowering the community to really articulate itself authentically. We also see that the lived experiences of researchers on topics being explored allows for a more kind of nuanced understanding of issues and information during the research. And this really can help to reduce things like the potential for misunderstanding that can be quite common in a more traditional or professional research. And I think too, involving peer researchers in analysis also really ensures that the wider research team doesn't make assumptions or misrepresent residents' views or opinions. And I think just to sort of draw a little bit of a loop here, and because I always do like to kind of give the sort of full view of an experience, there are challenges that come with peer research too. You know, things like needing more time and resource than with less participatory methods, having to provide a higher level of pastoral support or maybe mentoring to individual researchers, things like getting the buy-in from local stakeholders. But for this project and for other projects we've worked on, we're really certain that the quality and the authenticity, I think, of the data collected by peer researchers, as well as the impact of the findings, is far greater than if we'd taken a more traditional approach. So, as I said a little bit earlier, we decided to formalise the peer research work that Young Foundation have been doing for many years. And about 18 months ago now, we officially launched a national peer research network. We aimed to recruit between 15 and 20 new peer researchers from 5 locations to be part of the pilot. And in terms of who we wanted to recruit, the focus was very much on people who had no professional research experience, or people who maybe would have been unlikely to have had access to similar opportunities in the past. And we were all ready to roll out our peer research training, and then COVID happened. All sort of face-to-face aspects of peer research were cancelled, and you know, this included our training in London and plans for face-to-face interviews by peer researchers. We were going to look at a topic around community safety, and that then suddenly felt much less relevant as everyone was focused on surviving lockdown. We made a bit of a decision to kind of pivot that training and data collection offline. So we had 2.5 days of kind of face-to-face training that was then rewritten as 6 weeks of hourly Zoom meetings and home tasks. And we also switched the pilot research project to focus instead on people's experiences of COVID in their community, with an interview guide that was co-created with the peer researchers. We don't have time today to go fully into that project, but I'd encourage you to have a look as materials are available on our website. We found that the peer researchers so enjoyed being part of that project that lots of them have stayed with us, with many of them working with us on another project in 2021 on local economies, which was just published a few weeks ago. And as we were setting up that peer research network, we were kind of simultaneously conducting a couple of research studies on peer research in the UK. So one study exploring the kind of existing peer research approaches and one-on-one peer research in the UK. And I'm kind of weaving together findings from both of those reports today. So firstly, I'm going to talk about exploring what works in peer research. In an effort to kind of assess the state of peer research and the field of peer research in the UK today, we conducted an extensive desk review and we identified 48 projects that were planned, ongoing or completed during the past 5 years. And this initial desk review revealed a really rich array of projects that were using a peer research approach in the UK. I would also say that given the kind of novelty of the method and also the fairly non-standardised implementation to date, we also identified a number of gaps and opportunities in the field of peer research, and we'll talk about some of those together. This review revealed that peer research has been used by charities, universities, foundations, funded programmes, local authorities and social enterprises to generate some insights into the groups that they work with. And we also found that of the 48 projects we reviewed, they were led by 31 different entities. So only one project in the review was led by a local authority. And even though we really feel the methodology could be an excellent way to assess local needs and shape policies accordingly, when kind of not seeing numbers of local authorities taking up this approach yet. So I think that's something for us to put a pin in, and I'd be really interested to explore that further in our discussions. Amongst the kind of topics that were being explored by peer research that we found in the review, the most prominent was very much around service delivery. So peer research being used to investigate the kind of impact, quality, reach of services provided by local authorities, charities and funded programmes. So for example, Camden Council led a project focusing on families' experiences of child protection services in the borough. We also looked at a study from the Scottish Refugee Council evaluating the refugee integration service. And we found that peer research can be a really good way of enhancing quantitative, more kind of output orientated service evaluations with that bit more nuance and qualitative and experiential data that might otherwise be missed. In addition to service delivery, we also found the top kind of subject areas where peer research is being used are around things like youth, community issues and substance use. And we're also seeing a real kind of surge in the numbers of studies with young people particularly. So peer research with young people has become much more prevalent alongside a growing demand for approaches that really promote young people's voices around the issues that affect them. As well as finding these really rich examples of good practice, we also identified a number of gaps and opportunities in the field of peer research. And these gaps and opportunities really cluster around 5 areas. And they're around the extent to which peer researchers are involved end to end in the peer research cycle. So we didn't find very many projects where there was co-production across the cycle. We also explored opportunities for things like standardising training and for accreditation of peer research skills. And then kind of more relevant in the pandemic were opportunities around digital peer research particularly, and moving towards some more creative method use too, again with that digital angle. Our second report that was commissioned by the university, the Open University, and delivered by our Institute for Community Studies, sets out a really large range of examples where peer research has influenced positive policy outcomes. And again, it addresses some of those gaps in good practice models too. We conducted telephone interviews with 15 stakeholders who really kindly contributed their experiences and thoughts and opinions about lived experience in peer research. And the report focuses on 2 approaches, so peer research in the main, and also co-production through citizen engagement. And I'm going to walk through a couple of case studies from the report in brief, again, just to put some of the kind of positive policy outcomes from this work into action. The Staying Put programme, an 18+ family placement programme, was a pilot programme that launched in 2007, in 11 local authorities across the UK. And this programme offered young people in foster care the opportunity to remain in care until the age of 21, so they could really take advantage of additional support services and then transition into independence at a pace that was really right for them. The evaluation of that programme was commissioned by the Department for Children, Schools and Families, and it used a peer research approach to investigate care leavers' experiences of transitioning out of care under the Staying Put programme. And it was led by researchers at Loughborough University alongside Catch22, a charity working around national care advisory services. And as part of that evaluation, we had 12 care experienced young people from 6 local authority areas who were involved and kind of trained and recruited to take part in every stage of the research process. So they participated in kind of writing the research questions, designing the research tools, conducting interviews, analysing data, and then disseminating the research findings. And the evaluation revealed that for the majority of young people, being able to remain in care past that age of 18 and take advantage of the support that was offered through the Staying Put programme led to a much more stable and successful transition into independence. The positive peer evaluation of Staying Put led to the programme being put onto a statutory footing. So that meant that other local authorities are now required to support, advise and assist children in care to remain with their carers beyond the age of 18. And these changes were put in place after a campaign that was led by the Fostering Network and drew on the Staying Put evaluation, amongst other evidence, to really lobby for reform of the policies around leaving care. And I'm just going to talk briefly through a second case study, A City Within a City. In 2017, the Young Westminster Foundation launched City Within a City, which was a peer research project that really aimed to investigate the needs and experiences of young people living in Westminster. And the kinds of issues that the peer-led needs analysis touched on were around things like economic disparity, accommodation, cuts to youth services, education, drug and alcohol use, environment and employment issues. Again, this was a project that recruited 17 young people from the area to participate as peer researchers. They were trained and they participated in co-designing a survey, which was then administered to over 200 young people living in Westminster. And peer researchers really supplemented the survey by conducting some face-to-face interviews, and they held consultation events with young Westminster residents too. This report concludes by establishing a number of kind of recommendations, real peer youth-led recommendations for how YWF can play a role in targeting those priorities through increased and improved youth services provision. And again, in terms of positive policy impact here, in addition to kind of helping YWF set its policy priorities, the research was taken up as evidence by the local authority in a report that addressed the issue of knife crime among young people in the area. It cites the peer research report in highlighting the many challenges that are facing young people in Westminster, including economic inequality, overcrowded housing, peer pressure to engage in gang activity, easy access to drugs and alcohol, and lack of safe youth spaces. So we see this real rich evidence base coming out of this youth peer research approach. Our report highlights both opportunities and challenges in taking a peer research approach. So we found that recruitment takes time and it needs to be well thought through. People also told us that researchers should reflect the respondent groups that they'll work with. And in addition, the project should be as inclusive as possible. So building a team that's really representative as possible of the community that's being researched. People told us that pastoral support is really key. And we know from our work, it takes some significant time and effort when you're planning a project, and substantial thought needs to go into how peer researchers are going to be supported and cared for throughout the research process. Things like knowing from the start that real engagement with people with lived experience might require working weekends and evenings, for example, and making sure to build those things into research plans. We also highlight in this report some of the limitations and gaps, and we've talked about some of those, but namely kind of recognising that peer research can be resource and time intensive, and not all projects allow for this. So sometimes it may be that peer research is just one type of research in a research mix, because perhaps time doesn't allow for a full peer research approach to happen. And I think that's really interesting and something I'm interested to explore further. We very much realise that raising the profile of peer research requires an effort to familiarise policymakers and research commissioners with the benefits and the real best practice of the methodology. I don't think it's an accident that there was a really high concentration of peer research studies on the topic of foster care, for example. I don't think that's a coincidence. Staying put, as we've discussed, and You Only Live Once, which is another one of the projects referenced in the report. They're just a couple of examples of peer research conducted with young care leavers. And others include things like a What Makes a Difference project that investigated service provision for children in care. We came across multiple projects, peer research projects around care leavers. Each of these studies was contributing to strengthening the case for future peer-led investigations of young people in care. By contributing to the evidence base, and policymakers and research commissioners then focusing on foster care became attuned to that idea that peer researchers really had something worthwhile to contribute, start to listen, get interested in this approach. People told us that at the start it was really hard to engage commissioners, and there was a bit of fear, I think, there too about working with young people, a bit of a fear of the unknown, but also a fear around managing expectations, I suppose, too. If the local authority can't respond to requests or some of the changes that young people want to see in services. But then as people across different services and departments start to see that this is working and that things are changing for the better, they become more open to involving young people in genuine ways. So I think there's something about promoting peer research in a large part about proving its value to policymakers, who then become more likely to turn to the methodology as a way of generating insight next time around. There are ever-growing demands for people and communities to be listened to and to have influence over the issues that affect them. So I think it's critical that peer research and other forms of real sort of citizen research, citizen engaging research practice is really robust and of really high quality. And that's why the Institute for Community Studies and the Young Foundation are really committed to expanding our peer research network. We want to create a sort of a shared space for sharing of resources and evidence, and for exploring things like accreditation, which really support the improvement of quality peer research and other forms of community and citizen engagement, alongside our kind of growing national network of trained peer researchers, which we are keen to grow. So to this end, we're going to have a final word from one of our peer researchers in London. Noorjahan, many thanks for joining us today. I've got a few questions for you to bring this peer research approach to life and really give people a bit of an insight into the work that you've been doing. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can see you. Let's have a look. There we go. Noorjahan, do you want to introduce yourself first, and then I'll fire away with a few questions for you?
Of course. So, hi everybody. My name is Noorjahan Rowe. I work with the Young Foundation as a peer researcher. I have another day job, but for the context of here is I'm a peer researcher.
Firstly, I wanted to ask you, Noorjahan, why did you become a peer researcher? How did you get involved in this?
So very quickly, I was working with the Young Foundation on other projects, and an opportunity came up to become a peer researcher. And I kind of, went for it and did. And so that's how I kind of got involved as a peer researcher. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. I should elaborate more on.
Let me ask you a little bit about how that role works in practice on projects that you've been involved in.
So usually there is they will approach you and say, look, there's an area we're particularly interested in, and as to whether we in particular would like to be interested, if we are interested in the subject area. So usually that's how it starts off with, in a very practical way. And then because it is peer research, and the second question is, do we kind of know anybody, or can we connect with participants that are willing to participate within this project? So that's kind of how it works. Yeah.
And you recently were part of that study group on a piece of work around local economies. I wonder, just reflecting a little bit on your experience of being part of that study and that piece of work, has being a peer researcher made you think differently about your community? And maybe what are some of the things that you've heard?
I think, so when the local economy project came about, I wanted to interview people in particular that wouldn't traditionally participate in a project like that. And I think as a peer researcher, you have to be quite open to the subject area. So when you think about local economy, you almost have preconceived idea what that means. But you just kind of need to sort of leave that box a little bit. And I went and recruited older Bangladeshi women who traditionally wouldn't participate in research at all. And if you mention local economy, and these women have been housewives all their lives, they're migrant women, they came over, they raised family, very successful children. But they're kind of like, well, how does the local economy relate to them? And from the onset, you kind of think, oh, okay, even they said to me, well, we never worked. I don't know what you want me to say about the local economy. And then as you develop that relationship and as you explain the project, and as you said, Angie, it takes a while. There's a lot of peer research requires a lot of investment, investment in relationship, investment in sort of getting people to come on board and things like that. Once you had the buy-in, I think that's when things become a lot easier. And they had a lot to say about the local economy, actually. They had loads, and I think they were surprised as to how much that they had to say about it. And I think when you ask somebody and you explain where this work is going to go, how it's going to impact things, you hope, it's going to impact policy and so forth, it's validating that voice and sort of saying to them, your voice is just as important. And because these three women that I interviewed, like I said, they've never participated in research. They had, they never met a researcher. And I think if a researcher went into that community, first and foremost, these women would have said outright no, because what happens is it's quite intimidating, because there is that power structure at play. I'm the researcher, you're the participant. But because I knew them, I'm within the community, for me, they said, yeah, you're like our daughter, and it was, the conversation now was happening at even footing. And it was like, they were sharing with me. And I said to them, I'm learning from you. I'm trying to learn about your views, and I'm going to take it away. And that even footing, somebody from the community, I spoke their language, it's to understand, like the do's and don'ts almost of the community. I knew how to approach them. I knew how to get their sort of buy-in, all of that kind of experience. And these are, like you said, these are lived experiences, and I always use the example, Fiona, who's another peer researcher, she's up in Scotland. There is absolutely no way me turning up with hijab into a Scottish community, trying to do research. I don't understand. I don't understand the lies. I don't understand any of it. I don't have that lived knowledge to go in. But I do with these communities, these city women, that, I know this community I'm part of, and I'm invested in that community. And that's the other part of it, is when you're invested in a community, it's you want their voices to be heard. It becomes very important to you. It was really important that they understood how important they were, how their contribution was important, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, definitely in that way. So I hope, and they loved it. They really enjoyed it, and also the fact that Young Foundation also validated their time by making payments, for example, through vouchers and stuff like that. I think that's also really important, that you know, obviously you can't pay them for their time and whatever, it causes all sorts of complications, but to be made to feel important, I think that's really, really sort of helped with the buy-in and the participation. And remember, it was a 16-week project, so it wasn't as though I'm doing one-off and it was the end of it. It continued for a good number of weeks. And it's easy when you start off and you can lose people. To keep that momentum going, it requires effort as well. And like with any research method, there were challenges. So I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, it was all pretty. And, you know, I did lose a couple of people, and that was because things went wrong. And these are lessons to be learned, actually, to go back, because there's a do's and don'ts when you're a peer researcher. And when you're working with certain communities, it's really, really important that what the peer researchers say in terms of what will work and what won't work, that's listened to. So I remember like a couple of times you guys came with certain methodologies, and I looked at it and I went, okay, this kind of stuff is just not going to work. My participants are not going to do any of this. Yeah. So yeah, so can we change this? And it's that kind of stuff that you need to understand and willing to sort of take on board as well. That makes peer research so different. You know, because certain ways in which you ask questions for different communities will be different. There's certain things, like certain communities will just won't do it. It's no point in going in and saying, now we're going to do this activity, by the way, here we go. And you're not going to, and unless your participants feel comfortable in what you're doing, you're not going to get the authenticity. That's really, really kind of important to understand. And I think what was really great about working with the Young Foundation is when I went back to the researchers and I went, okay, look, you need to scrap this. It's not going to work with my participants. And they were like, okay, then tell us what will work. And I think that kind of being listened to, then I could collect the data that they really wanted. It was just, we collected it differently. It wasn't as though we're not collecting the data. It was different. And because I'm part of that community, because then, you know, I was able to feed that back. And I think, you know, I don't know if another researcher who wasn't from my community would have been able to do it the way I did it. I'm sure they would, but it's yeah, it's a bit different. I don't know if that's enough or.
No, I could see people nodding along when you were talking there, Noorjahan, and I think particularly that sense of it being a really iterative process, that things do go wrong along the way. And I think that's what I wanted to convey today, that honesty, really, that it does require that input of time and resources, but we absolutely feel it's hugely worthwhile as well. So thank you very much for sharing those experiences and hopefully inspiring people to come on a peer research journey too. Because of my technical hitch halfway through there, we've lost a little bit of time, so I'm going to make up a little bit of time we're going to move into some breakout rooms now, because it is a networking event and we want to have that opportunity to hear from you. So I've got some colleagues with me who I might just ask you to give a little wave. We've got Katria, Sean and Zoe that are here today, and we're going to move you into some breakout spaces with some Miro boards. Don't worry, you don't have to pop anything on those boards. I'm going to ask Sean to pop a couple of questions that we have for you just into the chat. But know that you'll also have a facilitator in your group who's kind of walking through those questions too. And I think, Noel, I'm just looking to see if I can see you on my screen to see if we're ready to move through into those rooms now.
We are. So Sean's group will stay in the main session, and everyone else will move into breakout rooms. So I'm gonna.
Can we have the time for 10 minutes, please, just so that we have time to come back and hear some insights too? Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds great.
Much appreciated. Thank you very much.
So many of you will be leaving into your breakout groups, and those that will rest will be in Sean's breakout group.
That's great.
And I'm going to stop recording as well.